Good morning, this is Angela with Parco's Permaculture. I am up in my front yard right next to the street this morning, so there may be intermittent car or city bus noise in this video. I recently put a poll up on my Patreon where I asked my patrons what they felt I should make my next video about, and overwhelmingly the response was how to prune lilacs. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to be pruning lilacs, and I'm going to walk you through my 4-step process to pruning lilacs for optimal health and optimal bloom next year. So when I say lilac, what I mean is Syringa vulgaris. I'm not talking about the shrub that is commonly grown in this part of the country that is called California lilac. That is Ceanothus, and please don't prune it this way. It requires a different pruning method to get good blooms and good shaping. So Syringa vulgaris is a multi-stemmed shrub that is native to the Balkan region, and it flowers best on the previous season's growth. So that means you need to prune it right after it is finished blooming, and that will help the plant send up more shoots and suckers from the base, and also help regenerate the tips of the shrubs. And that way you will get a whole season's worth of vegetative growth this year, so you get more blooms next spring. So like I said, I have a 4-step process for how I evaluate and prune my lilacs. First, let's talk about the tools that you need to do this.
When pruning your lilacs, you will need a set of secateurs or hand pruners, gloves, and a pruning saw. And if you're like me and it's early in the morning, a strong cup of coffee.
So you know it's time to begin pruning your lilacs when the blossoms start to look sad. If you look back at my Earth Day video, you can see this lilac was a lovely purple. It's from the Hulda Klager Lilac Garden. I got it about 9 years ago. And it was a lovely shade of purple, and now it has faded to white with brown. Time to remove these.
Deadheading is done by taking your pruners and making a single cut between the blossoms and the first set of leaves.
So I have deadheaded both of these lilacs, with the exception of a few blooms that are still doing very well, that when I am done filming, I will be cutting and putting in a vase in the house. Those last few that look real good. So this may not look like a lot of blooms for 2 mature lilacs, but keep in mind, I picked many of them for arrangements throughout the season. So these are just the ones I allowed to persist on the shrubs.
The next part of pruning involves reducing the overall height of the shrub and thinning it out through a method called tipping off or tipping back. Lilacs frequently produce a triad of stems where the central leader will bloom and then send off 2 side shoots. Sometimes there is just 1 leader that blooms at the end. When you get the triad shape, you want to remove the spent blossom in the middle all the way back to where the 3 branches connect. In order to shorten the overall height, you can reduce triads even farther down. Looking at this triad, you can see there is additional growth beyond and above this section of 3. I am still going to come in and clip out the middle section, leaving the 2 sides to form a Y. This will help produce blossoms on both of the side branches next year.
So with a lilac being a multi-stemmed shrub, much like our elderberries or any of the other shrubs we grow for maximum bloom and fruit production, here we want to focus on removing the oldest and thickest wood because it is going to be less productive. Some folks say you should remove any major branches that are bigger around than your thumb if you want to keep your lilac heavily flowering and diminutive. But for me, I find that doing that, sometimes I end up with a lilac with very big, lush blossoms, and those blossoms then tend to flop if all of my shoots are kept really small. So I do let some get thicker. But I want to remove the thickest, oldest wood, and that will encourage the production of new suckers from the base. So if you have a lot of big old stems, consider only removing 1/3 of them this year to maintain the shape of the shrub. So let me go in. I am going to take out this big boy right here, and then I'll be back. So that's 3 of my 4 pruning steps completed. I have deadheaded, which helps me get a good look at the shape of the shrub and move on from there. Some folks might say, why not just remove the largest stems first? Because then you will automatically deadhead some material. I find it much more useful to deadhead so I can get a better picture of where the shrub is going and not be distracted by blossoms. I have tipped back the middle of every triad, and I have removed 1/3 of the oldest wood at the base of the shrub. Now I'm going to do the 4th step in my typical pruning cycle, which is to remove any thin, straggly shoots, suckers coming up from the base of the shrub that are either crossing or too far from the center of the shrub, or they're just not looking super healthy. So I want to take all of those out. Now, when you take these out, you have the option to snip them at the base of the shrub, or take a shovel and jab it in there and remove them, and those suckers will root and you can give them to your friends. So that's a great, easy way to propagate a lilac. When you are removing those suckers that have walked too far from the center of the shrub, think about sharing them with folks. They root very readily, don't need any rooting hormone. If you use a shovel, you can sometimes get a little bit of root off with them. Half of my lilacs I have gotten from cuttings or suckers, and I've had great rooting success. So just stick it in the ground about halfway and it should root. Let's take a closer look at what I'm talking about here. This is coming up not too far from the center of my shrub, from the core of the shrub. So I'm going to keep it. It's a good thickness, about the thickness of my index finger, and it will get larger and will be productive in the future. But this little puppy right next to it is kind of thin and flimsy, and it is growing the wrong direction and crossing with this other healthy branch. So I am going to remove that all the way at the ground with my hand pruners, okay? Now, you can take this and cut it back, leave a couple of leaf nodes on it here, 1, 2, cut it back just above 1. If I take this and I stick it in the ground about halfway, most of the time it will root. In fact, when you are pruning your lilacs, be careful where you throw down the prunings because they root easily. Here's another example of thin or flimsy material that I want to remove. And while it isn't coming all the way from the base, you can see it is growing here. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that. Those branches won't get big, they won't be productive, they won't help you out. Now, farther up, these little guys, these will flower next year. So I want to leave those. So here's my finished lilac. I have not finished the one behind it yet, but I'm going to keep it about that height so that I get that stagger of blooms. But here you can see I've removed 1/3 of the dead wood. I like the shape of it. It's not too tall. It should send up new suckers to fill in some of the gaps where I have removed the oldest wood. And it will bloom all along the tips of this new growth that continues to grow this spring. So I should get a lush show of blooms next year. And I've been careful to keep some of the lower branches, mid-height and highest, so that I get a continuous swath of blossoms up the plant. That helps ensure that we don't have the problem that a lot of lilacs get, where they're very dead in the middle and the blooms are all way up high out of reach. So I hope that helps give you a look at what I do to prune my lilacs and keep them the shape and size that I want and keep them highly productive. Now, a friend messaged me recently and said she had an old lilac that had just 2 main stems, and all of the center is like dead and covered in lichen and doesn't bloom, and all of the blooms are way up high at the top. What do you do if you have that situation? So this calls for a little bit of courage on the part of the gardener. What you need to do is a total rehab of your lilac. If you have a lilac that's in that situation, you've either neglected to prune it for many years, or you've inherited it or moved onto a property that had a lilac that had been neglected, take it and cut it all the way to the ground. Remove everything. It seems really radical, but if all you have left are very thick old stems coming up from the plant and you don't have any small suckers, you need to rehab it. So in general, you remove 1/3 of the oldest wood, but for a total rehab, cut everything to the ground. You want to do this in spring so that the plant has all of late spring and summer and fall to send up new shoots and regenerate it. You may find a decrease in blooms the next year because you really cut it back, but you may also find it's reinvigorated and you get more blooms than you've ever had before. It just depends on the lilac. Now, if you do a total rehab on your lilac and you cut it all the way back, please be sure and feed it. I will be feeding my lilacs with comfrey tea and also a good layer of leaf mold or compost, because I want to encourage that new growth, that new development of suckers from the base, so that I get good blooms next year. So if you need to encourage an entire rehab, tons of new growth, please make sure you fertilize and care for your lilac after you cut it back to the ground. So I hope that helps you with some pruning tips. I hope that you are able to effectively prune your lilacs to get the best display for next spring. If you got something out of this video, please give it a thumbs up. Please share it with your friends. Please consider subscribing. I also have a Patreon, as I mentioned at the beginning of the video. I'm going to be continuing to make exclusive content for my patrons. Folks who choose the highest level of patronage get a special gift in the mail. And I want to make sure that I am polling my patrons to produce the kind of content that y'all want. So I'll be putting up more polls. This video was made because my patrons requested this topic. So I'll be back soon, hopefully talking about tomato planting, because that's what's next on my schedule. Hope you all have a happy Mother's Day, and I'll be back.